May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Jesus sent the disciples on ahead while he dismissed the crowds. He had just finished feeding 5,000 males and who knows how many women and children. The feeding of the 8,000 is what we're going to call it today. And he dismissed the crowds and he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. This is a sacred moment in the life of our Master. And any parent can tell you they've done the exact same thing. They sent their family on somewhere else to get them out of the way so that they could just have a moment of peace and quiet. Have you ever had that moment in your life when you really just literally want to kick the crowds out of the way? I'm not talking about recent months when we've all been stuck in our house by ourselves. That's a different thing. You want to call the crowds to you. Come close. Jesus had been trying to pray before this. In fact, before the feeding of the 5,000, he had retreated from the crowds because his ministry had been such an amazing success. I mean, the text doesn't say it, but he had to be a bit weary. And if not tired, he needed at least some time to collect his thoughts. And knowing what we know about him now, we understand he was actually connecting with the divine presence that we call God. And if Jesus needed to do it, how much more do we need to do it? Where I grew up, Jesus was just doing what they call getting prayed up. Have you ever heard that phrase before? You got to get prayed up. Oh, it was a very popular phrase, especially among the older women in the community. They could use it in a variety of ways. They could tell you that they themselves had already done this. Oh, I'm all prayed up. And to think about what it means, think about filling up a gas tank in a car with gas. To get all prayed up is to get full of the Spirit, to have spent time with God, and you have filled your spiritual gas tank. I'm all prayed up, they'll say. They could also use it in other ways, sort of a warning to you. If you ever would tell somebody in the community that you are going through trials and tribulations, or you're about to go to something that you know is going to be a trial or a tribulation, they'll say to you, well, you better get prayed up. And they could also use it as a sort of admonishment. Well, things have been better had you gotten prayed up. So I encourage you to use it with your friends from time to time. It's a great little trick, you know. Jesus had to go up to the mountain by himself to get prayed up. And of course, after he does this, he descends the mountain. The disciples have already departed for the other place that they were headed, and they were out making their way on the Sea of Galilee, I suppose. And they're in the middle of this tempest, this storm where the wind was crashing the waves against their boat. Jesus appears to them, literally walking on the waves. And these men, accustomed to the sea the way that they were because they were fishermen, they weren't afraid of the storm. What freaked them out was a man walking on water. Now, Peter has this moment that I love, and for years I used to read Peter as being sort of testing Jesus. Well, if it's really you, then you can, make it so that I can step out of the boat. But as I've spent time with the story over the years, I've decided it's not really testing necessarily. I actually think Peter, in that sort of impulsive way that we know from our texts, the impulsive way that was part of his life and his ministry, I think he was actually awestruck by a moment of possibility. And the thing that made other people scared was something that made him excited. Can you talk about roller coasters? Some people love a roller coaster. Oh my God, they cannot wait. They get in line to get on a roller coaster that will take them upside down and twist their body in all sorts of ways. Now, I like the land. I'm a good land person. And land that sits still as well. I mean, some things get people excited and it makes other people scared. Do you follow what I'm saying? Think about people with tarantulas as pets. Have you ever had a friend with a tarantula or a snake as a pet? I mean, like, little chihuahua that gets eaten by the other pet. Do you follow what I'm saying? This is not a pet. But other people, some of them look at the snake and they go, oh, it's Agnes, my sweet pet. And I'm like, oh, no. Agnes, sorry, I can't get to know you. Peter saw something that excited him. And in that moment, he wanted to live more fully into that moment while the rest of the people cowered in fear. And he's like, hey, if it's you, then I could probably step out onto the water with you. And in that moment of impulsivity and excitement, the line between what is divine and what is human became so thin as to almost be unrecognizable. As Peter's ability to imagine what is possible led him out onto the water. And even if it doesn't say how long. I imagine it was probably about 2/3 of 1 second before he started sinking, before he realized what it was he was getting himself into. The uh-oh moment that we all have. Even if it was 2 or 3 seconds, the moment was glorious. And then as he began to sink into the water, into the waves, he cries out, what? Lord, save me. Which was Peter's own form of prayer. And here I think what Matthew is saying to us is to pay close attention to the difference between the prayer before the storm and prayer during the storm. You see, Jesus was praying before the storm. He got prayed up, as they say. He filled his spiritual gas tank before the storm ever hit, and it enabled him to walk on water. And Peter, although his prayer was just as real and just as heartfelt, was said in the midst of the storm. And yes, Jesus responded to him. But I think what Matthew is saying to you and to me as church is always pray before the storm. And brothers and sisters, have there been a lot of storms? I don't mean just literally like the ones that have flooded the church twice in the last week, ripped trees from their moorings, and devastated people's property. Those sorts of storms, yes. And boy, we've had plenty of those. But the other storms of life, this pandemic that is hanging on for everything, squeezing the life out of our communities, of our ability to be one with one another. This pandemic is a storm that has lasted so much longer than any of us so naively thought about early when they said, oh, we're going to cancel church for 2 weeks. We're going to take remember that? We're going to take 14 days and then everything's going to get right back to normal. The storm has lasted so much longer and been so much more intense than any of us imagined at that time. And yes, our prayers in the midst of the storm are being heard, but how would it have been if we had prayed before the storm? If we had gotten prayed up before it? And the other storms of life, that terrible explosion, I'm sorry, it was not a bomb, the explosion, or we don't think it was a bomb, in Beirut. That terrible experience of watching human lives literally evaporate before your eyes. To get prayed up before the storm, to get prayed up before the diagnosis, to get prayed up before the pink slip, to get paid up before the goodbye. If we can train ourselves, if we can find the time, if we can make the time, because you have to make the time. Did you notice in Jesus' life how he literally had to make the time? He had to manipulate the situation to get the disciples out of the way and then to get the crowds dismissed so that he could then retreat to time with God. the time isn't just going to appear. And for even among us who have not a lot of things to do on our schedule these days, there's still plenty of things to keep our minds busy so that we don't make the time to pray. It can be checking the news again. That alone takes up enough of our energy and our time that we don't devote to being with God. So, brothers and sisters, from the text of Matthew, from Jesus' own example, I encourage you, get prayed up. Fill up your spiritual tank so that you and the church will be ready for the next storm that will come. Amen.